a comenzar con algunas preguntas que hay acá. Ahí tengo una pregunta para el profesor Gaxie, que la estaba viendo por acá. Un momento, dice, está en inglés, así que voy a leerla. Dice, if survey respondents do not provide genuine and trustable answers to public opinion polls, how can we explain that many political attitudes tend to correlate fairly, robustly, with variables such as class, race, or gender, or even with country-level variables? I say it again. If survey respondents do not provide genuine and trustable answers to public opinion survey polls, how can we explain that many political attitudes tend to correlate fairly and robustly with variables such as class, race, or gender, or even with country-level variables? Yes, I think because you were saying, I'm trying to make an interpretation of the question. You were saying that we cannot really trust some question of public opinion surveys. So the question is, if we can't trust those questions and surveys, how can you explain that there is an association of this question with other variables, as gender, class, and also country-level variables?
So not all answers to opinion polls dealing with democracy and democratic legitimacy may be considered as true, genuine opinions. It does not mean that opinion polls are not able to grasp some opinions, about democracy and democratic legitimacy. My point is, it's not a precise measure, but at the same time, we can grasp some answers, and that is the reason why there are relationships between answers and, as you mentioned, education, social class, and gender, and age. But the problem is with close-ended questions that we may observe some variation, some correlation, but we are not able to understand the meaning of the answers, and therefore the meanings of these differences according to gender, and education, and social class.
Muchas gracias. Ahora tengo una pregunta para la profesora McCall. Aquí dice, usted dice que la percepción de inequidad es menos relevante cuando hay estabilidad económica. ¿Cómo influye el acceso a un mejor estado de bienestar? Aquí dice, quizás ese factor es tan relevante como el aumento de los sueldos.
Yes, that's an excellent question. I think that there are two ways to think about this issue. And I'm going to go back to the post-World War II period, because I think that that's really the foundation for the way Americans think about reducing inequality. So there was rapid and equitable growth in the post-World War II period. And living standards grew dramatically over that period, perhaps consistent with what's been going on in Chile in the past decade or a couple decades. Now, there was also considerable welfare state development during that time. However, most of the revenues that were raised during that period were raised as a result of growth in income. They weren't raised as a result of raising taxes or marginal tax rates. Of course, marginal tax rates were actually quite high at that point, but effective tax rates were not significantly greater than they are today. So there's sort of reality and perception. The reality is that economic growth and the policies of employers who provided health care and pension, the best employers provided these kind of welfare state policies. Of course, they were undergirded by subsidies from the US welfare state, but that was invisible. Okay, so this is what's been called the hidden welfare state. And so I believe that the welfare state is not seen as responsible for reducing inequality, even though it has a role to play. But I think that economic growth actually played perhaps a greater role than welfare state policies.
Thank you. Tenemos aquí también un par de preguntas que están relacionadas, son para el profesor Gaxie. Le preguntan, ¿puede usted comentar los conceptos de active consent de Gramsci? Y hay otra pregunta que también hace relación a Gramsci, dice, ¿cuál es la relación entre su concepto de legitimidad y el concepto gramsciano de hegemonía? Y si es así, ¿es la legitimidad una forma de dominación o una forma de consent, como consentimiento, ¿no?
My point this morning was to try to explain that we generally have a very too much intellectual view of legitimacy. And I think that Weber, for instance, has a very intellectual view. I mean, he assumed that everybody, or at least a significant proportion of the population, have an explicit, somewhat reflexive or pre-reflexive view of legitimacy. And I think the same is true for Gramsci. And for instance, I think that the Marxian and the Marxist view of ideology is far too explicit. And I think it's a kind of intellectual bias in the analysis of social realities. That was my point this morning. Of course, there are explicit views of legitimacy, including ideological view in the Gramsci perspective. But my point is these views do not exist in the whole population. It's only in, for instance, in educated categories that we may observe something which close to the Gramscian or to the Weberian view of legitimacy.
Muchas gracias. Estamos un poco atrasados en el programa, así que lo que voy a hacer una última pregunta a la profesora McCall y luego por suerte, varias de las preguntas vienen escritas en inglés, así que se las voy a pasar a ellos para que ellos puedan hacer como un comentario general de las preguntas al final de la mesa redonda. Pero voy con la última pregunta de esta parte para la profesora McCall. Está en inglés. How can we explain that Americans place so much weight on companies for redistribution? Could that be explained by the Tocquevillian idea that civil society, companies included, must take care of societal problems? Yes.
I didn't get the beginning.
Okay. How can we explain that Americans place so much weight on companies for redistribution? Could that be explained by the Tocquevillian idea that civil society must take care of societal problems?
Yes, I think it's possible to think in those terms. I think it goes back to the first question and my response to that question. I prefer to take a more of a historically, of course, de Tocqueville was historically based, is a historically based theory, but to sort of think about this not as an inherently cultural orientation of Americans, but something that is rooted specifically in the post-World War II period. It could also be rooted in earlier eras as well, but a lot of things changed between the 19th century and the post-World War II period. I think another issue that needs to be discussed is the trust in government. and the extent to which government has been seen as the agent of redistribution. Now, it's not that the government is wholly distrusted. A lot of people make the argument that the problem is that Americans distrust the government. The results that I'm finding about education policy, however, contradict that. So it's not as if there was an across-the-board response against increased spending on all kinds of social policies. In fact, there was support for increased government spending on education, and there's quite high support for greater spending on education. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be conflict over the specific types of educational policies, but it does suggest that there are certain domains in which Americans do support policies that are initiated by the government. One other area would be government regulation of business. So government regulation of business tends to be quite high in the U.S. So contrary to the view that there is no support for intervening in the free market in the U.S., Americans tend to be highly supportive of certain kinds of government regulation of business. Certainly when it comes to the environment. Again, these are complicated issues. There are trade-offs involved. I am, generally speaking, within the school of public opinion in the U.S. that sees American views, sees citizen views as kind of good enough, sort of competent enough, at least on some issues. On other issues, there might be a lot of misinformation. So we need to go on an issue-by-issue basis. So I don't want to simplify American views here. But with respect to inequality and intervention in the business sector, there tends to be high support. Seymour Lipset found this, actually, and argued this in the early 1980s. And he's one of the main proponents of American exceptionalist views.